Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel GeoPod. Today I like to go over a strategy breakdown, a strategy relating to NATO and how it can effectively counter the threats of today and some of the future threats it may be faced with. Obviously, NATO finds itself in quite a predicament as of right now. The reason for that being is that now more than in the past decades or so, the enemies of the Western world are cooperating, expanding their ties and their networks in an attempt to form an active bloc to oppose the Western world. First and foremost, I like to say that NATO, in my opinion, has fallen short in recent years to grasp the full extent of the threats it is faced with, and has failed to take adequate measures within the geopolitical spectrum in order to address these threats. As of right now, Russia is waging a war in Ukraine, a war that may very well spill over into other European countries, especially European NATO member states. However, it is wrong for us to think that Russia posed the sole threat to Western civilization in this moment in time. The fact of the matter is that Russia is part of a bloc, an ever-expanding, ever-growing bloc, that constitutes not just Russia, but also other parties such as China, Iran, North Korea, and the member states of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which was erected in the 90s, as with the sole purpose of countering NATO and standing as an opposing element to NATO expansionism and to NATO's influence in the geopolitical sphere. So our enemies are not singular anymore. They're part of a bloc that is seeking to expand its influence across the globe, is seeking to add new parties to it, seeks to expand not just militarily or politically, but economically as well. What all these parties have in common is that they are relatively isolated. They for a very long time have remained isolated. We're talking about countries such as Iran, heavily sanctioned. We're talking about countries such as North Korea, heavily sanctioned. Countries such as Russia, heavily sanctioned. However, now that they're aligning themselves with each other, that they're creating more extensive and more profound partnerships, it allows these countries to emerge from their isolation and thereby pose a greater threat to the West. As of right now, there is already a bilateral security pact between North Korea and Russia. A dire development given the fact that North Korea stands as a nuclear power itself. Iran has long helped maintain Russia's war effort within Ukraine, having played an instrumental part in Russia's drone capabilities and drone production. In fact, the bulk of Russia's drones that are currently manufactured and produced are done so with Iranian components. The Geram drones are basically replicas of the Shahed drones of Iran. Kamikaze drones, decoy drones, intent on swarming opposing enemy aerial defensive systems to bypass their aerial security and defensive measures and provide maximum damage, or rather, the opportunity of maximum damage. NATO, per the Washington Treaty of 1949, right now is a transatlantic organization. What that means is that it comprises of nations and member states bound to the Atlantic area, Canada, the United States, and the European nations. However, Russia and the bloc it's now a part of, consisting of Iran, North Korea, the CSTO, and China, is seeking to expand its influence on a global scale. Not just within their respective territories, but also within Asia, within the Middle East, within Latin America, within Africa, which is a very contested continent, and a continent that the Western world has saw its influence declining for a very long time now. NATO must understand that if it wishes to properly and adequately address the threats of tomorrow, it must expand its boundaries. NATO must expand globally. NATO must bolster its partnerships with its already existing partner states. Right? Apart from its member states, NATO has various states where it has deep partnerships with some of these countries. Let's see, Australia is one, Japan is one, South Korea is one, Colombia is one. So although these countries are not necessarily NATO member states, they are partners of NATO and often cooperate with NATO in particularly in cyberspace or in other matters relating to the geopolitical sphere. However, thus far, in-depth and profound cooperation on military matters remains absent. So the first thing that you want to be doing is bolster your partnerships, especially militarily, economically and politically, with these partner states. Bolster your ties with them to the fullest extent possible. But the greatest problem that NATO must overcome are the boundaries and the restrictions within Article 10 of the Washington Treaty. Now, Article 10 of the Washington Treaty revolves around which states are eligible for NATO membership. And the way it's written right now, only European members or European states can be eligible for NATO member status. Now, the reason why this was done, the reason why this was written in 1949, was because the threats the Western world was faced with pretty much lay immediately next to the European borders, right? We're talking about primarily Russia and the Soviet Union. So there wasn't much need for NATO to expand on a global level, given the fact that all the threats that they were faced with came from next door. However, as I've said before, that is no longer the case. Russia is seeking to expand its influence globally, knowing that NATO is bound to the Atlantic perimeters. It seeks to bolster its partnerships with China, with Iran, with North Korea. Iran and China in particular, two nations who are also actively seeking and bolstering partnerships within Africa. In fact, the country of Niger has recently ousted the presence of US military in favor of security agreements with Russia. So this stands as a very dire development given the fact that one of the greatest threats to countries that poses a great threat towards Western civilization or the survival thereof is gaining influence in continents where yours is dwindling. And this might not look as much now, but trust me, if this is allowed to continue, and if NATO does not respond adequately, it may find itself outmaneuvered and outflanked by this ever-expanding military bloc of totalitarian regimes that seek to overthrow Western civilization, or in particular Western dominance within the geopolitical spectrum. Article 10 must be reformed. It must allow for states on a global level to become eligible for NATO member status. Given the fact that the threats NATO and the Western world are faced with as of this moment in time are not bound to any respective territory. We're talking about the spread of radical Islam. We're talking about the spread of totalitarianism. We're talking about the rise of dictators such as Putin and Kim Jong-un. Now, all of these entities, all of these parties adhere to similar narratives, which is to besmirch the Western world, to actively seek to counter the Western world and eventually overthrow it. So we must look into these regions where these entities are active in right now and seek to expand their influence. We must look into these territories, into these areas, and expand our own influence so as to pose a proper deterrent, a similar deterrent that we have in Europe as of right now. Those reforms will be perceived as drastic, yes. They will be met with a huge amount of controversy, yes. Unfortunately, they are necessary if NATO is serious in addressing the future threats, in maintaining its dominance, militarily and politically, in the world of tomorrow. There are certain states, for example, that I believe would be incredible partners and incredible additions to the NATO alliance. First and foremost is Japan, which I deem to be the most strategically important partner within the Pacific. Now, obviously, the entire military doctrine or entire security doctrine of Japan revolves around self-defense and self-preservation. So aligning that with NATO member status might be a very challenging endeavor. However, I believe that doctrine may change in 10 years or so if the Chinese threat evolves the way analysts as well as myself believe it will evolve. Japan will pose an incredibly sound partner, as will Australia, again, a country which has long had valuable partnerships with NATO and the Western world. A country that would wish to enter into the NATO alliance, but is prohibited from doing so due to Article 10. Article 10 is outdated. The CSTO does not adhere to Article 10. And as of right now, Iran, North Korea and China, yes, they are not officially a part of the CSTO, but they are part of the bloc that Russia is actively forming. And they very well may become member states of the CSTO in the near future. So when that occurs, it means that the CSTO is now spanning across the entirety of Asia as well as the Middle East. Meaning it already encompasses more territory geographically than NATO does, apart from the Atlantic Ocean, that is. Latin America has long since adhered to very anti-Western narratives and stances, something that Russia has long sought to utilize, even back in the days of the Cold War. But also Iran. Venezuela is a very good example of this. Venezuela and Iran have bolstered their ties dramatically over the course of the past few decades. So what we're seeing is that the enemies of the Western world are actively traveling beyond the parameters of NATO, beyond the parameters of its influence, and are actively seeking out new allegiances there, as to outmaneuver and outflank NATO in the geopolitical sphere, in the geopolitical spectrum, that is. NATO must address these threats. NATO must react accordingly. The Washington Treaty was formed in 1949. The threats of today and the threats of tomorrow are not the same as they were back then, especially if you take into consideration the information space. The narratives set on discrediting the Western world that are being ousted, that are being spouted by Iran, by North Korea, by China and by Russia, in order to alter the perception on a global level regarding what the Western world constitutes, regarding their reliability, politically, economically, militarily, all to discredit and besmirch them, so that they can rise up as the more favorable partner. That's what they wish to do. That's what they seek to do in the end. Overthrow Western dominance in every sector, politically, economically, militarily, technologically. So NATO must address these threats, and the best way in going about that is to do the same as what your enemy is doing, but more efficiently. Previously, I recorded a clip about how NATO can counter Russia within the information space. And I placed significant emphasis on the lauding of shared value, shared ideologies, stability, security, freedom and prosperity, territorial integrity. These are all things all elements, all themes NATO can utilize to counter the narratives and the information campaigns of its adversaries, especially if it targets certain nations that are more or less isolated as of right now, or at least find themselves free from any particular bloc, whether that be it economically, military, or politically. And it is not just the task of the United States to do this. No, I see a huge task here for France, Germany and the United Kingdom as well. Great military, political and economic powers of old, who in my opinion have long procrastinated, sat back on their laurels as the United States stuck the NATO boat. No, they should expand their influence into these territories, into Africa, where the France and the Brits long had long-standing influence, into the Middle East, into Latin America, into Asia. Bolster partnerships, create new partnerships. Especially the Gulf states are very strategically important here, given the fact that they can actively pose a block against Iran. NATO must think on a global scale, same way its adversaries do, if it wishes to mitigate the threats of tomorrow, and still be the dominant party 10, 20, 30 years from now. It's what Secretary General Mark Rutte says. Our deterrence is good for now. It's tomorrow I'm worried about. And it's incredible. It's logical. It's logical to be worried about that. Because as of right now, NATO still is not doing, in my opinion, what it needs to be doing. Yes, it has been awoken by Russia's aggression into Ukraine. But it's not fully awake yet because it doesn't seem to fully grasp the full extent of the threat that Russia, not just Russia, but the bloc that it's part of, poses to the Western world. Certain articles, Article 5, Article 6, Article 10, are outdated. They need to be reformed. NATO must expand on a global scale. NATO must stay 1 or 2 steps ahead of its adversaries, promoting the same ideals that they did throughout the Atlantic region. Shared values of territorial integrity, freedom, prosperity, sovereignty, and stability and security. And I believe many countries within the Pacific, as well as in Asia, Africa, the Middle East and Latin America, will be very susceptible to that message. The game is already in play. China is moving, Iran is moving, North Korea is moving, Russia is moving. And they will not stop just because NATO does not move. If there's ever an opportunity for them to get an advantage over the Western world, to find a way in which to outmaneuver it, they will effectively do so. Without hesitation. Without consideration for stability, peace and prosperity, or global security. If NATO wishes to remain the most dominant entity, it must adapt to the current and future threat landscapes, thereby expanding globally, thereby posing a global deterrent rather than a regional one. This is all I want to share with you today. If you have any questions or comments for me, please feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. You may also reach out to me to one of my social media platforms, and I aim to get back at you as soon as possible. I thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this clip, and I hope to see you all again soon on this channel. Thank you, and have a good day.